What is the epistemology of psychedelic experience? In preparation for this week's lecture, this week's topic on epistemology, I was a little bit excited to find that there's a lot of interesting work to be done in this area. And I think mainly it will involve bringing all the concepts and tools and ideas developed by epistemologists and bringing that into the topic of psychedelic experience. Chris Letheby, who if you're a student in my class, you've definitely have heard that name, and you should definitely know that by now, has done a lot of work in this regard, has really advanced the conversation. So you'll see me cite him a lot. Some of the beginning parts of this presentation really is going to draw from his work. If you're interested, I do have a reference at the end of the paper. And then as we continue, I'm going to introduce some new concepts, but mostly the goal for this will be for you to understand a little bit better what kind of questions are asked in the context of the epistemology of psychedelic experience, and also to show that by bringing in distinctions in the field of epistemology in general, we can start asking more sharp, more precise questions. Now, at this point, you might be like most people and not have any single idea what this word means or what I've said so far in regards to the word epistemology. So let me try to help with that in a bit. So consider something like epistemology of science, which is, again, something you might not have ever heard of it, but people who work in this area ask questions like, how is it that science manages to know about the world? Why is it so successful in being able to understand the world around us? What is it about their methods, their practices, their objectivity, their social structure that allows them or leads them to knowledge? Similarly, in an area called philosophy of religion, and a subfield of that, you might find the epistemology of religion. And that's just a fancy word for something that any religious person has. If you are religious or spiritual in any sort of way, I am willing to bet that you have an epistemology. And that epistemology says, it tells you how it is that you come to know about the divine, about God, about spirituality, whatever it is your religion is about. You have beliefs about how to come to know and how to grow, say, spiritually, how to grow in your mind about God and so forth. So basically, when we're asking about the epistemology of psychedelics, we're doing something similar. We're asking how it is that psychedelic experiences relate to knowledge. And I think when these topics were first coming out in what would be like 50s, 60s, 70s, these were very related to sort of the mystical or the divine. So we can distinguish two conceptions, and they're epistemic conceptions. These come again from Chris Letheby. One is the entheogenic conception, which is more of a fancy word that you might just substitute for like mystical or spiritual conception. And this says that psychedelics, as a matter of fact, put us in contact with the divine, the transcendent, the otherworldly, something like that. By contrast, we can think about the hallucinogenic conception. And this is the idea that psychedelics cause experiences that are just hallucinations. Pretty straightforward. Now, I call these epistemic conceptions because both of them tell us that, as a matter of fact, we do these experiences do have effects on our knowledge. One thinks it gives us knowledge about the spiritual, for example. The other one says it distorts or causes hallucinations, so we actually do not get knowledge. So it sort of is disruptive to our knowledge. Now, one of the main motivations for trying to carve out alternatives to both of these is the prospect of using psychedelics in therapy. And scientifically minded people that are not necessarily wanting to buy into the entheogenic conception don't also want to buy into the hallucinogenic conception. In other words, if they want to treat someone with depression, they don't want to say, okay, we're going to make you hallucinate, but in the end, that's going to be good for you. Now, they could do that, but it would be interesting if there's another epistemic conception of psychedelics by which we can operate in the world. Okay, so now I'm going to survey some concepts in epistemology, and as we go on, I'm going to show what kinds of questions they help formulate in the area of psychedelics. All right, so first is this very common, very well-known distinction between know-how and know that, and you might put it in terms of distinction of the kind of knowledge you have of riding a bicycle and the kind of knowledge you can get from reading a book. So know-how is just like this ability. You don't really describe riding a bicycle, right? You don't just say left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. You just sort of get on and go. And even if you try to describe it, that would just ruin your ability to actually ride a bicycle. By contrast, there are just a bunch of facts you can learn by picking up a book and reading it, and those are called knowledge that. All right, so then let's go into a little bit of both of each. Okay, in regards to know-how, Letheby has written that he thinks psychedelic experience, in short, can help you gain an ability. Which ability is that? An ability to let go, open, and accept. All right, so for example, psilocybin and LSD usage correlates with a trait called openness to experience. Now, just one critical point on this, my colleague Noam Tiran, who will be writing a chapter in a forthcoming book on this, thinks that instead of focusing on the way Letheby presents it, thinks we should think about it more as a character trait, so that the experience might cause a character trait instead of an ability. Anyways, that is for further discussion, but we won't decide on that today. All right, the part I want to go more into depth is this idea of knowledge of facts or knowledge that. Now, knowledge that has traditionally been analyzed and defined as three ingredients, we might call it: belief, truth, and justification. So imagine I have knowledge that it is raining outside. Okay, so the idea is I must first believe that it's raining outside. It must be true that it's raining outside, and then I must have some good reason or some justification for belief in that it's raining. And it seems that if I miss any one of those, then you would want to say that I don't have knowledge. So imagine that. Let's just take belief. Let's take out belief. Imagine that it's true that it's raining outside, but I don't believe it. You might just say, I just don't know it. And I might even have some justification. Like there might be some notification on the weather of my app of my phone saying it's raining outside. So I go and I look at the evidence that it's raining. It's true, but I just don't form the belief. You might then say, I don't know it. All right. Similarly, if it's false, so I might even, let's take out the truth condition. If I believe it and I have the evidence or some good reason to believe it's raining, like somebody told me, hey, it's raining, but it's actually false, then you would be likely to say that I don't have knowledge. Why? Because it's not something that's true. Okay, so what I think is useful about this is that if we want to know the relationship between psychedelics and knowledge that, or our knowledge of facts, we can start breaking apart by belief, by truth, and by justification, and then start asking more precise questions, right? So the question, does psychedelic experience lead to knowledge that, can be broken down to these three levels. And then these three levels can themselves be broken up, right? So does it lead to belief? I think that this is an important question that sometimes is too quickly overpassed, right? So in one psychedelic report we saw a couple of weeks ago, somebody reported this experience where they're about to open a curtain and they knew they were going to see God. And as they're opening this curtain, they see their children, right? And in another experience is somebody had this belief or this experience where they became one with a flower, with a rose. And so an interesting question to ask here, like, do people then come to have a belief that they are a rose, or at that point that they were a rose? No, months later, if we ask them, "Are your children God?" will they say, "Yes, my children are God"? And even if they do they mean that literally? Are they expressing a belief? And so, to my knowledge, this is an important question, because if it turns out that the answer is no, then when we're analyzing the epistemology of these sorts of scenarios, we might not be asking whether this is related to knowledge that. Okay. Does it lead to truth? And this one's a little bit more straightforward. This is related to the entheogenic conception, right? But it also might be related to this question of, if it doesn't lead us to a belief, but it leads us to some sort of insight. What kind of insight is it? And is that insight truth tracking? Okay. And then next, a big point is, does the experience give us some sort of justification or some sort of good reasons to form our belief? And now there are actually many sources of justification, right? So your beliefs that you hold are the result of reason, memory, introspection, people's testimony, and perception. And so here we can generate at least 5 different categories of questions of asking what kind of effect does psychedelic experience have on these things. And depending on what we say on each one, we might say that it does or does not offer justification. Just to give one or two examples, right? So on the idea of introspection, there's a big question of whether, when people are on psychedelics and thinking about their past or thinking about their mind, do they actually learn something about themselves or about their history or about their mind? Or is this being constructed, or is it being made up? Right. So these are questions about the justification the experience confers on the person. Similarly, in the Compass manual on MDMA assisted therapy, it mentions that MDMA might enhance the someone's ability to see the therapist as trustworthy. It might enhance features like focus on like the face or features of the person, and the person might be more inclined to trust and therefore accept their testimony. So there's a big question there of how does that relate to justification? Usually when someone gives us their word or they give us some piece of information, we take it on their testimony. And does the fact that I was closed off before for some reason, and on some psychedelic experience, I'm more open to believing what someone says, how does that affect the warrant or the justification I get from that person's word? Okay. Next, we could also ask what justifies a belief. And here a lot has been said, but there's at least 2 interesting ideas we can look at. What justifies a belief? Evidentialists say that you are justified in holding a belief when you have some evidence for it. It's like experience, right? Or some data. Reliabilists, on the other hand, say that you're justified when your belief depends on some reliable source or a reliable procedure. So it's not just that you have an experience, but that you went through a step-by-step process that is, as a matter of fact, likely to get you to truth. And so just one point I want to make here is I think this reliabilist asks us to look at different levels. So we are no longer just asking, does the experience itself somehow just give me justification for some belief or some perspective? But we can individuate different levels of a procedure. So it could be someone on a psychedelic experience thinking by themselves. It could be someone thinking in a clinical context. And it could also be someone in a traditional ritual kind of a setting. And all these sorts of procedures are going to involve different causal structures that, depending on which one you're talking about, you might say that the justification differs. All right. And the point here is just, I think the reliabilist way of looking at justification makes it very clear that we need to distinguish these types of settings. Okay. So now I think there's other interesting concepts that can come about. And so this is going to be something that also comes from Chris Letheby. And imagine Napoleon, right? So none of us have actually met Napoleon. He died long before we were ever born, but we could still learn a lot about him. We can watch YouTube videos, we can go to encyclopedias, you can go to a lecture, you can read a book, right? But that's different than if you had actually met Napoleon, right? So you might even learn the same things about Napoleon from reading than from meeting him, but the mode that this data is presented to you just is different. It will have different impact on you. And so one of the things Chris Letheby says is that psychedelics might alter the mode of presentation, so that you might learn old facts in new ways. And so what kinds of facts, old facts, might you learn? Well, one of them is you might learn about the potential of your mind. And one of the potentials of your mind is to stand in awe and a sort of reverence and inspiration and a sort of almost religious level or spiritual level attitude towards the world around you. Now, I think you'll know, or at least you'll believe that you are capable of that, but maybe you've been a city dweller your whole life, so you kind of just lived in the sort of day-to-day. Maybe you've never really gotten into the whole religious stuff. And so one of the things that psychedelics could do is just show you that you have this potential to have these experiences, these life ways towards the world around you. Also, this idea of ego dissolution, this idea that there's a change to your sense of self, can really bring to mind the malleability of yourself and how your self is really dependent on sort of life and society and experience. Okay, and now here's another concept, and the best way to get at it is to ask yourself the following question: would you voluntarily become a vampire? And I mean, to a certain extent, you might say no, because you don't like eating other people's blood, right? But there might be some other cool things, like maybe you watched a bunch of movies that really hyped it up for you. Maybe the fact that you'll live for a very long time compared to humans, that might also really hype it up for you. But the main point, either way you decide whether you would choose to be a vampire, is the point is that you really just don't know what it's going to be like. I mean, imagine hundreds of years and not being able to see the sun or something like that. And so these are called transformative experiences, right? It's an experience that changes you so drastically. But even before you do that, you don't know what it's going to be like. And we don't have to go as crazy as vampires. There's these kinds of experiences all over in our lives. I would say coming to college for many people could be a transformative experience, especially if you grew up in one mindset and then you come in, college is a completely different mindset for you. But also like becoming a parent, I think when you become a parent, a whole bunch of like biochemical reactions happen inside of you, and you just start valuing and thinking about the world differently. So becoming a parent might be a transformative experience. Okay, so this is the cover of the book that really put this concept in the mind of many philosophers. And so my thought here is that just maybe psychedelics are like this. Maybe they're transformative experiences. And if so, then this sort of distinction that we've been working with between the know-how and know that doesn't exactly fit, or doesn't exactly work to assess the entirety or all the subtle sort of epistemic questions we want to ask about psychedelics, right? So if it's going to completely change you, then we need the concepts and ideas that are used to assess the rationality of transformative experiences, and take those concepts and we got to apply them to psychedelic experiences. All right. So there's some evaluative concepts we can use when we're trying to evaluate the beliefs that someone has. So a belief someone has relevant to the evidence can be permissible, impermissible. It can be obligatory, irresponsible, blameworthy, right? So the idea is that maybe you believe something that is permissible, that just means that the evidence doesn't rule it out. If it's impermissible, that means the evidence like really strongly rules it out. If it's obligatory, that might mean that the evidence for it is so strong that you must believe it. So like you might say like me believing that this thing is in front of me is obligatory because like it would be really irrational for me not to believe it. I could also be irresponsible with the evidence. I might have a responsibility to know better. And then finally, I might form a belief, but that might be blameworthy. Okay, so now we could ask questions about what is the basis of these concepts. And there's at least three views I want to mention. One is the idea of deontology, which is like, again, I think an extra fancy word for this idea that just like there's laws of nature governing the material world, and maybe laws governing the ethical world, there's also laws governing the mental world of thought or of ideas or of thinking. And so deontologists would think or would say that you are obligated to believe according to, for example, the principles of probability or the principles of logic. By contrast, there's consequentialists who think it's not really the principles that ground these evaluative concepts, but it's the consequences, right? So they might say you're obligated to believe in such a way, for example, that you maximize true beliefs and avoid false ones. This is important also in some of the discussions of the epistemic innocence of psychedelics, like Chris Letheby. So one of the thoughts there is that even if psychedelic experiences cause illusions or hallucinations or distortions in your beliefs or false beliefs, that in the long run there might be more beneficial consequences epistemically. And so that might be interpreted as a consequentialist kind of argument. Again, I mentioned earlier my colleague Noam, who thinks that maybe what's really going on, or what we should really focus, is the effect on your character. Or does the psychedelic experience make you more open-minded, for example? Does it make you more, or does it make you more closed-minded? And does it give you the right, like if you're too open-minded, that might mean you're too gullible, or you're too susceptible to being misled. And so one thought might be we should just focus on the character. All right, and then one last set of concepts I think we should look at is this idea of an epistemic wrong to someone or an epistemic harm. So you might wrong someone or you might harm someone in various different ways. Epistemically, you can lie to them, you can give false testimony, you can insinuate, you can be inattentive to evidence, you can indoctrinate someone, you can obstruct them from the evidence, you can distort the evidence, you can mislead, gaslight, and lastly, we can perform what is called epistemic injustice. Epistemic injustice became well known through the work of Miranda Fricker, and there's now a huge literature on this. But two common distinctions here are one, testimonial injustice, and this is just something like judging someone's perspective based on their identity. And so it's very common in medical context for a doctor to not believe a woman is in pain, and many people think it's precisely just because they discount that person's identity. They just say that women might not know better, or they might just feel that they're overly sensitive or something like that. And that's a sort of testimonial injustice. But there's also a sort of hermeneutical injustice, and this is understood as an injustice occurring when the cultural, conceptual resources put someone or some perspectives at a disadvantage. And here, one of the famous concepts is that idea of sexual harassment before the 1970s. So the idea here is that women in the workforce were being sexually harassed, but they didn't, that the word didn't exist yet to say, hey, that what you are doing there is sexual harassment. And so they would try to voice concerns, but no one would really realize the concern because there wasn't just the words didn't exist to track the kind of harm they were experiencing, the kind of harassments they were experiencing. And once this word was coined, sexual harassment, many women were saying, you know what, wait a minute, I thought something was weird, and people were saying I was just overly sensitive or something like that. So the point is that they were disadvantaged not just because of their identity, but because the culture itself lacked the resources for the women being harassed to clearly state their perspective and the harm that was being done to them. So how might this be relevant? And here is a conjecture. It's sort of off the top of my mind. I'm not saying that this is, as a matter of fact, true. But if psychedelic users who have reported benefiting from this through various different ways of like personal use, have lacked the conceptual resources to articulate just how they have been benefited, because these experiences are often difficult to describe, so they're called ineffable sometimes. So if that's true, and there's a long history in our country of making the substance illegal, criminalizing it, and making it a taboo or a stigma, then these users may be suffering a sort of hermeneutical injustice. And so on this view, one of the benefits of psychedelic research at an interdisciplinary level turns out to be a sort of justice activity. Okay. Hope you have enjoyed the introduction to the epistemology of psychedelics.